Welcome to the Intentional Encourager podcast, where each episode brings you compelling conversations and stories designed to entertain, enlighten, and encourage. And now here's your host, Brian Sexton.
And welcome into the Intentional Encourager podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sexton. Thank you for joining us again today. And it's funny how you have people on your podcast that do this for a living. And it's slightly intimidating because when you're somebody like me that has limited skills and you're talking to a guy that does it on an extremely high level, it's a little intimidating, but we're going to get through it and we're going to have a great conversation. And this guy is with Sweet Fish Media, James Carbary. He produces podcasts for B2B brands, author of Content-Based Network, the executive producer of B2B Growth, which is in the top 100 marketing podcasts. I'm telling you, man, I am already just intimidated because of the presence of this guy on this podcast. You can find him on LinkedIn at James Carbary, but you can find him right now on the Intentional Encourager podcast. James, how you doing, brother?
I'm fantastic, dude. You are way too kind, and there is nothing to be intimidated about. You're over there crushing it.
Well, it's the blind squirrel theory in full effect. We find a nut every once in a while. Hey, James,
I'm looking forward to this, man. It's gonna be fun.
This is great. And if you see it on video, James has got the killer the mic stand with B2B Growth, and he's got the killer set up there. And if I would take my virtual background down, you would just see how janky my setup is compared to his. So it's great. Man, let me start here. What do you think and what do you see when people approach your company, and I love the name, Sweet Fish Media. I'm getting hungry, dude, because it's close to lunchtime. But when people approach you with an idea and they go, man, I would love to do a podcast, but what's the first thing that you get people to get out of their own way of when doing a podcast or thinking about launching a podcast?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. So we work with a lot of companies. So those are the types of folks that are coming to us. They're typically a VP of marketing at a mid-market B2B technology company. That's the market that we go after. And I think one of the biggest hurdles that we have to get them over at first is, are people actually listening to podcasts? And so the response to that is twofold. One, yes, they are. And you can, that's evidenced in, you can pretty much ask anybody, do you listen to podcasts? And they at least listen to one or two. But the other thing that I think
the exception is my wife, James. I had to jump in there, man. My wife, if you ask my wife, does she listen to the Intentional Encourager podcast? She's like, no.
Lisa doesn't listen to our podcast either. She listens to a bunch of other ones. She couldn't give two turds about B2B growth.
Great, man. I love the way you put that. I didn't mean to jump in there because our wives are our biggest critics, man. And they're like, well, at least you might listen to your husband. And my wife goes, no, I listen to him talk enough.
Not a chance.
But I want to build on what you just said there, because that was my biggest thing in launching a podcast. I'd done a ton of live radio. People kept saying, you need to do a podcast. My biggest fear was not knowing what I didn't know and how to actually get started. Do you find when you work with companies, do you find that it's a lack of something to say? They don't think they have enough to say? Or is it, how do we even start by doing this? How do we launch this thing the right way?
Yeah, I think it's how do we launch it the right way? I think I also don't think that they understand that podcasting, the benefit of podcasting is more so in the value they're going to get from the podcast as a content flywheel. So thinking about the podcast as an engine that creates lots of different content, right? So we're recording this on Zoom right now. You'll probably be able to get 4 or 5 clips out of this interview from micro videos that you can use on LinkedIn. You might have somebody from your team turn it into a slide deck on LinkedIn. That's another piece of content. Some people do audiograms. You could turn it into a blog post. You turn it into content for your email newsletter. So the podcast itself, even if your wife was the only one listening to this, Brian, if she does decide, it's someday she wants to listen to your podcast, everybody else says I'm out. If she's the only one that listens to it, the content that you can create from the podcast, it's actually still worth doing it just because of the content flywheel that it creates. The other reason, and it's what I wrote the book about, content-based networking, the value from your show is more in the relationships that you can build with your guests that you feature. And so when we first started B2B Growth, obviously it's nice to have a top 100 podcast. It's nice that we've been able to rank for the term B2B and B2B marketing in Apple Podcasts. So we've ended up attracting an audience, but even if we didn't have an audience for the show, it would still be worth it, because when I reach out to a VP of marketing at a B2B tech company and I ask them to be a guest on the show, they usually don't ask how big the audience is. They just say yes, because it's very rare for someone to be asked to be a guest on a podcast, especially if you're not an author or if you're not a big name in the space. And so we intentionally go after people that we think could ultimately make a decision to buy our service. We invite them to be a guest on the show. We highlight their expertise. We talk about what they're an expert in. And then the friendship starts to happen. Then we actually, because we've had an interaction with them on our show, we stay in touch with them on LinkedIn. And if we think that they could be a good fit for our service, we'll either bring it up to them or they bring it up to us. And that's really the value of podcasting for companies that nobody is thinking about, is when you're a media producer, you can all of a sudden get your foot in the door into rooms that you've never otherwise would have been able to get into, but you can step in because you host a podcast, or because you do a blog, or because you have a LinkedIn video series. It doesn't even have to be podcasting. It can be any sort of media. But whenever you turn your spotlight on the other person, it's how Oprah became famous. Oprah has an extremely compelling story, but we don't know. Oprah's not a household name because she's got a compelling story herself. She's a household name because she became famous interviewing famous people and shining the spotlight and being vulnerable. And like, her approach to interviewing is fascinating. And she got famous on the back of highlighting other people's stories, both famous people and non-famous people, honestly. And so I think we can take a lesson from Oprah there and go, man, I can grow my influence and I can grow my reach by shining the spotlight on others. And you're obviously doing a fantastic job of that with this show. But yeah, that's where I think the benefit is that a lot of folks are not necessarily thinking about. And so my entire book is about how do you reverse engineer relationships with the people that can actually help you make your dreams come true. And in a corporate setting, that tends to be referral partners, or it tends to be potential customers. But it could also apply to the college student who's trying to figure out what the heck they want to do. And they want to know hiring managers of companies they want to work for in their city, but they don't know how to get to know them. They just hope that their resume gets picked from a stack. Well, if you started a show called, Best in Huntington, or whatever the name of the show would be, and you went and interviewed business leaders at companies in your city, now all of a sudden you would have relationships with people at these companies that could actually hire you. And you took the reins of your own life. Instead of waiting on them to come to you, you proactively did something that allowed you to go to them.
Well, and James, I want to unpack that for just a second. There was a ton of truth there in what you just said. That's the whole reason for the Intentional Encourager podcast, because I've got 25 years of sales management, customer engagement experience. There are a lot of people doing sales podcasts. Mm-hmm. I wanted to do a podcast that put expertise aside, because the reason that I did the Intentional Encourager podcast is, and I didn't realize it when we started, was when people are going through things like we've gone through with this pandemic, expertise is not nearly as important as encouragement. And I wanted to spotlight the stories. I wanted to tell the stories of people like yourself who are influencers on LinkedIn, who have larger platforms that I'm connected to and are friends with, that people didn't know the backside of the story. People didn't know the obstacles that they have overcome, because everybody just sees, oh man, James has got this huge platform. He's killing it right now. Man, I wanted to showcase the grind. I wanted to showcase what was behind the reason why. That's why I reached out to you, James, was on a post that I commented on, and I said, man, why don't you come on the podcast and tell your story? And obviously it was compelling enough for you that we made it happen.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do. And I love what you said there. It has never been easier to get your message across right now, especially if you're a business. Why not do a podcast? And not to offend anybody in the radio space that sells advertising or things like that, because it's a necessary component. But man, you can advertise yourself and tell your own story in your podcast and be an authority in whatever you do. Let's say you're a tire shop in Huntington, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
Well, man, do a podcast on, hey, winter's coming. We're going to do a podcast today. We're going to do a 20-minute podcast on the stuff you need to do to winterize your car. And it's a 20-minute infomercial in a podcast. Or, you call up the guy that's the VP of marketing for Firestone, and you have him on your podcast, or the VP of product development for Bridgestone, and you have them on your podcast. I love what you said there. So let me go here just a minute, James. What do you think the biggest challenge is for podcasters today? Because the space is getting more and more crowded. So what's the biggest challenge for podcasters that you see? And how do podcasters kind of go, how do they keep the fuel, the encouragement going to keep going when their audience doesn't seem to be growing? That's the question I really want to ask.
Yeah. So I think what I see most podcasters lacking, they're doing it for the love of talking to smart people. They're doing it for the love of almost like the art of it. It's a very fun thing to do. You're getting to hop on and you're talking to people that you never would have talked to before. You're getting to have fascinating conversations. You're learning a ton yourself. But the thing that I see a lot of podcasters lacking is strategy with their show. And content-based networking is a critical piece of the strategy, especially if you're in B2B. And so many people think the show needs to be about me, or the show needs to be about my expertise. But you notice with B2B Growth, we did not name the show the B2B Podcasting Show. And that was very intentional. We didn't name it the Sweetfish Media Show. We named it B2B Growth because that's what our ideal buyers care about.
Why James Carbary is an expert. That you didn't say that, right?
Right. And so you do that for a couple different reasons. One, people that we're trying to reach, they're in-house B2B marketers at these tech companies. They're not searching for B2B podcasting inside of podcast apps, because B2B podcasting is a sliver of what they're having to think about on a day-to-day basis. They're thinking about how do they grow their company's brand. They're thinking about, how do I hit the metrics that my CEO is wanting me to hit? They're thinking about MQLs and SQLs, and how do I align with my sales team? And so we want to create content that is helpful for them on their terms. And then we'll sprinkle in content that showcases our expertise, but the show is not about our expertise. So that's a massive mistake that I see companies make. They want to name the show after themselves or one of their core values or their expertise, when in reality, the people that they want to listen to the show don't actually care about their expertise as much as they care about getting their job done and experiencing success in their job. And so the SEO firm that just does a show on SEO, it's limited in the benefit that it's going to add to their ideal buyer, because a show all about SEO is likely going to draw a lot of your competition, other agencies that only focus on SEO. So if we did a show on podcasting, it would likely draw, we would have a much smaller audience than we have today. And most of our listeners would be our competitors that are also doing podcasts for companies. And so it just doesn't make a lot of strategic sense. The other thing that I see companies missing out on is getting all the juice from the squeeze that they can from their podcast. So I'll give you two examples that I don't hear anybody talking about. Everybody knows you can turn it into micro videos and blog posts, and you can turn it into every podcast episode into a lot of different content. But what I don't hear people talking about are original research and mastermind groups. So with we're starting to go back to some former B2B Growth guests and we're asking them to be in these small groups of 5 to 7 people. And everybody, Brian, is talking about community in the macro. They tend to measure the success of a community by its size.
Yeah.
And I really think that the success of a community has more to do with its intimacy, and intimacy is born in small numbers. And so in a small group that meets monthly, 5 to 7 people, you and I know this well because of our experience with church and with our faith. But applying that to business, when you have a show and you're inviting strategic people to be a guest on those on your show, those people could potentially do business with you. And after the interview, you ask them like, hey, I'm getting 5 or 6 other guests from the show to be a part of this monthly mastermind group. Would you want to be a part of it? This is going to be the structure of the group. It's an hour a month. Now you're developing real depth with those relationships, and an ongoing way to keep in contact with them. So that's one way to leverage a podcast to create deeper relationship, which can map to business results. The other way is original research. So if you come up with 5 or 10 questions that you think your target market would be interested in, and you ask those questions, not necessarily in the interview. I think that would make your interviews kind of boring if you just ask the same 10, 15 questions every time. But if you do it in the pre or post interview, record it separately, then you can round up all of the answers to those questions and put out original research that says, for us, we're in the middle of doing this. We've done 56 or 57 interviews with B2B marketers, asking them the same 15 questions. And it's going to fuel our entire 2021 content strategy from the insights that we're going to pull from these 100 marketers answering these 15 questions. We're going to be able to say things like, 57% of the B2B marketers that we surveyed said that this was the most underrated B2B marketing tactic. Well, that's going to be a really powerful insight for a B2B marketer to want to know, which is going to make them want to consume more of our content and ultimately get them interested in possibly working with us when it comes time for them to want to do a podcast. So original research and mastermind groups are 2 massive ways to squeeze more juice out of your show. And I think when you start to see all of the benefits that come from it, whenever you see that your show is only getting 67 downloads an episode, it doesn't really matter to you because you're getting value from it in so many other ways.
Yeah, and that's the thing, James. And I love what you said there, because again, I think people we live in a society, and I just released an episode with Bunny Sumner Young that you can go see. She's a business therapist. And Bunny said something great about social media. She said, most people post on social media or interact on social media, and it's a dopamine release. It is a let me refresh, let me see, who's commenting, who's liking, things like that. I love what you said there about the number of downloads, because somebody could come on your podcast. They could drop an unbelievable nugget of knowledge that to them is a throwaway line.
Mm-hmm.
But to you and your team, you had that, and I had that moment with guests. Mm-hmm. A guest will tell me a story, and they may think, or part of their story, and they may think, oh, I've always told that part of the story.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like, oh my gosh, there it is. It's that what I call the money note moment. It's that aha moment that you wait for an entire episode, and there it is. To your guest, it's a throwaway line. To you, it's incredibly, it's like, there it is. Like, if I'm going to audio clip that, if I'm going to audio clip anything, I'm audio clipping that, because it's the thing that resonates. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about resonance for a moment in a podcast, because I want to pick your brain on this one as well too. Somebody's listening and they go, I know why I listen to podcasts, but why for a business is it important to know why other people listen to podcasts?
Yeah, so I think businesses need to understand that businesses don't listen to podcasts, right? Humans do. And so we also don't sell to businesses. We sell to humans that work for businesses. And so you hear a lot of people in B2B say that it's not B2B, it's P2P, it's person to person and human to human. You hear all of that all the time. And I think you've got to apply that to this medium. People are listening to podcasts, and they're not just listening to business podcasts. They're listening to podcasts about parenting, about their faith, about serial, the whatever, the murder mystery, podcasts and stuff that are happening all over the platform right now.
Yeah.
And so humans are listening. And if humans are paying attention to something, then you as a business need to figure out how to get yourself there. And I think you've got to be able to deliver really valuable and, to your point, relevant content. There's one thing that we've been teaching a lot this year. We call it POV discovery. It stands for point of view discovery. Yeah. And the thing that we've been teaching a lot of our clients to do is to ask 3 questions in the pre-interview with your guest. And in that pre-interview, you're trying to draw out a distinct point of view, something that they believe that a lot of other people might not believe, or they might not be exposed to that type of thinking. In those 3 questions, the first one is, what's a commonly held belief in our space that you just passionately disagree with? And that will get them talking about something that probably goes against the grain of common knowledge. That content tends to be incredible. The other 2 questions are similar. It's, what's something that people in our space should start doing today that they are not currently doing? And then the next one is, what's something that people in our space should stop doing today that they probably are doing, but is hurting them in some way?
Yeah.
And so when you ask those 3 questions, you're going to get 3 different responses. You then pick up on what's the most compelling thing that this person said, and let's build the episode around that. What's the most unique, differentiated point of view from those 3 different point of views that they just shared? And let's hone in on that. And then whenever we go to do the interview, we're not just talking about fluffy duffy, the same stuff that, if you, Brian, being in the sales and marketing space, that everybody talks about sales and marketing alignment, and that your sales and your marketing team needs to be aligned. If I hear one more person tell me that sales and marketing needs to be aligned, I'm going to go throw my head through a wall.
Yeah.
Hey everybody, Brian Sexton here. I want to tell you about our sponsor, SEO National. SEO stands for Search Engine Optimization. Now, what's that, you might say? Well, search engine optimization helps you show up higher on search engines in front of paying customers for words that you as a business owner can monetize. What a great concept. SEO National is owned by my good buddy Damon Burton, who's been a guest here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Not only has Damon and his team worked with businesses of all sizes, from e-commerce startups to NBA teams and Shark Tank featured businesses, but more importantly, Damon and his team are about transparency, trust, and providing lifetime value. So much so that he still has his first customers after opening SEO National 14 years ago. Let me give you some intentional encouragement and call Damon and his team today at 855-736-6285 or go to www.seonational.com and get a free quote.
Let me jump in there. I got to jump in there. First of all, shameless plug, People Buy From People. My book will be out late November. So, shameless plug on my own podcast there. But you brought that up. I don't think sales and marketing should ever be aligned, because marketing typically has no idea what sales does, especially outside sales, which was the world I lived in for over 20 years. Because again, you've got somebody in an office typically, and if the marketing person does go out into the field, it's to work with salespeople to get a feel of what. So I think you're 100% right. And the second thing I wanted to jump on there and kind of piggyback is this. And I said this when I was talking to somebody just on a one-off conversation. I said, listen, I would rather be a contrarian than a copycat. Because here's the thing, and you James, you hit on it, and I love the way you hit on it. Think about people that are absolutely crushing it in business right now. They're disruptors.
Yeah.
They are absolutely disrupting to the market to the point that people have to pay attention.
Mhm.
And then once they've gotten that attention, they're able to attract that customer because they say, listen, if we screw up once, you don't ever have to do business with us again.
Yeah.
And they take that really rogue, radical approach and go, listen, if you give us a shot once and you don't like it, listen, we won't bother you again.
Mhm.
We failed. But
Yeah.
if you give us an opportunity and you really like the experience, you like what we're about, we would just ask you to continue to do business with us again and again. And they're disrupting mindsets and they're disrupting thinking. I love that, man. I had to jump in there because I think those questions are critical that businesses are not asking about right now. It's like, okay, why would you not
Mhm.
want to totally disrupt the thinking of your customer?
Yeah.
Because if they're not thinking about you, who are they thinking about? Your competition.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I love that. James, let's pivot in the time that we have left. I
Yeah.
want to be respectful of your time and the audience's time. Let's pivot to telling your story. You and I talked briefly before we jumped on here. You've got an interesting background. And so I want you to take us as far back as you want to from point A to where we are today and tell your story along your journey of how you got here to where you are.
Yeah. So I grew up in a very, very small town in central Oklahoma. Was born in California, moved to Oklahoma when I was 2, and was raised by a single mom. So my sister and I were raised by a single mom. Dad left when I was about 2. Came back into my life a little bit, later. I was like 20, 21. He recently passed away, but we were fortunate to have built a relationship in the later part of his life. And so grew up single mom and grew up Catholic. And so didn't really have a relationship with Jesus until I turned 15. And at 15 became a Christian, gave my life to Christ. And really at that point, I started getting discipled by my best friend at the time. His name was Chris Wallace. And that was a massive turning point in my life, obviously. So Chris's investment in my life in high school really just cemented in me what my priorities should be. So I want to
I
love
got to
God. I
jump
want to
in
love
here.
people.
I got to jump in here.
Yeah.
So your dad leaves when you're 2.
Yep.
You and your family moved to Oklahoma, single mom. What was that like growing up for you as a kid, not having your dad around? Because we see that more prevalent
Yeah.
in today's society. The book that I'm writing is about my dad. My dad was in my life until the day he died. And I often wonder what it's like for you growing up.
Yeah.
Did
So,
it affect you? How did you work through that as a kid?
yeah. So I'm sure it affected me. But when you're a kid, I mean, you know what you know. And so because he left when I was so young, I didn't know what it was like to have a dad around. So my reality, it was just normal for me. I hung out with a bunch of guys that didn't have dads too. So you were almost like in our little circle. If we ever started hanging out with somebody that actually had a dad, we kind of saw them as the oddball. And so I think I was very, very fortunate in that way. I wasn't a bitter kid. I wasn't pissed that I didn't have my dad around. I'm sure it was hurtful, and I'm sure I've got, some issues as an adult from, the ramifications of not having a father in my life in those days. But I think, I don't know, it's just been really cool to see God's hand on my life in the ways that he's provided for me, not having that, by putting incredible men in my life, Chris in high school, and then that parlaying into college and having incredible mentors, getting involved in our church in college, and having guys that were on staff at the church really pour into me, invest in me, call me to stepping into leadership that I didn't really think that I was capable of doing. And in stepping into that leadership, God continuing to refine things and put more people into my life. And so I get into college. I'm really thriving at that point. I started to come out of my shell. I'd started to figure out that I was really curious about people, and because of my curiosity for people, I kind of became a people magnet. So it was very like at our house. I bought a house when I was 21. We would always have people come over to our house. We were the kind of the house where everybody wanted to hang out, and I loved it. I was like living my best life whenever there were, 27 pairs of shoes in my front little, right by the front door. And so really started to see that God had wired me in this way to try to build community and want to bring people together. And so that was incredible. And then won a sweepstakes when I was 22 years old. I didn't win it, but my roommate's brother-in-law won this sweepstakes through Alltel. And it was one of those things where you text 1-800-ALLTEL or you text football to 1-800-ALLTEL and you win an all expense trip to a professional football game of your choice. We got to win that sweepstakes. We go to New York City, watch a Giants Cowboys game with Barry Sanders. It's this unreal experience.
Okay, I got to ask you. I've been dying to ask this.
Yeah.
Growing up in Oklahoma, Sooners or Cowboys?
Sooners for sure.
Okay, so you grow up an OU fan, and you win this all expense paid sweepstakes.
Yeah.
You don't get to hang out with Troy Aikman or Brian Bosworth, who played at Oklahoma. You hang out with Barry Sanders, who plays for the other guys. Yeah.
Yeah, it was still pretty sick. I don't care where he played in college.
Oh, it would be incredible, man. Like I said,
that was unreal. But on that sweepstakes, Brian, I met a guy named Jeff, and I thought Jeff just worked for Alltel. He was facilitating all the transportation for the trip, and he had arranged the limo bus, he had arranged the jet, all that stuff, really behind the scenes, but he was on site as well, kind of making sure that we were getting from point A to point B. And I just hit it off with Jeff. Again, at this point, I had already discovered that I was very curious about people. So I was asking a lot of questions, and we ended up talking about business, faith. We ran the gamut on the topics that I talked about with Jeff. And so by the end of the night, he gave me his business card. We swapped contact information, and I really didn't think anything of it. I thought, I'm never going to see this guy again. So we got back on the jet, went back to Oklahoma. It was a one-day trip. And about a year later, I'd stayed connected with Jeff. And about a year and a half later, he called and asked if I wanted to move to Orlando, Florida to run the helicopter division of his business. And I was blown away. I thought never in a million years would I get the opportunity to go and do helicopter logistics for NASCAR. His clients were in the NASCAR space. And I thought, well, this is crazy. So prayed about it, took the opportunity, and ended up moving to Orlando. And that relationship with Jeff really changed the trajectory of my entire life. I was working corporate jobs, bounced around from insurance to oil and gas, and it just felt like a fish out of water. Like I knew I wasn't supposed to be doing the corporate thing, but I didn't know what else to do. None of my friends were entrepreneurs. I wasn't exposed to anybody else doing their own thing. And so by getting the opportunity to go work for Jeff and see an entrepreneur operate a business day in and day out, it gave me the confidence that, like, oh man, this is what I should be doing. I should be running my own business, not trying to go make it work in corporate America. And so I worked for Jeff for 3 years, met my wife in Orlando. We met at our church here in Orlando. And so apart from that chance serendipitous encounter with Jeff, I wouldn't have a business today, more than likely, and I wouldn't have met my wife. And so I say all that to say that I relied on serendipity, and most of us, I think, rely on serendipity to meet the people that we have in our lives. And so when we came up with the concept for content-based networking, it was really out of a desire to help people not have to depend on serendipity for 100% of the relationships that can have a life-changing impact on their life. What if instead of depending on serendipity and depending on winning a sweepstakes and meeting somebody that could offer you a job a year later and bring you to a city where you'd meet your spouse and open your eyes to what your career would be? What if instead you proactively said, what do I want to accomplish? What are the dreams and goals that I have for my life? Who are the types of people that could help me get to those dreams and goals? And then how can I create content with those people so that I can ultimately build a friendship and hopefully add value to them so that they can that they can help me get to where I'm wanting to go, but I've got to make it about them. Yeah. And so that's really the story that led to what we're doing today. Now we produce podcasts for companies using the same strategy, helping them find their, ideal referral partners, ideal customers. So in a nutshell, that's the story.
I got to ask you, when you connected with Jeff, and it's a one-day sweepstakes trip. You're going with your buddies, but you're meeting people, and you're like, man, I'm probably never gonna connect with these people again, or
Yeah.
have anything. When you get around a guy like Jeff, what's the one thing that you learned from Jeff that really helped you and really kind of shaped what you would go to do? Because you stay connected, and then he calls you for an opportunity. But what was it that you specifically learned from him that's helped you propel yourself in your own businesses?
Yeah, so I think persistence in that, and I don't know if I necessarily learned that on that day. We talked about a lot of things, and that was, I don't know, 12 years ago. So I don't remember the specific nuances of the conversation on the day that I met him. I know I remember being enthralled, learning that he was the CEO of this global logistics company that did stuff with, Verizon and the Olympics and the Super Bowl, and did all these massive events. I remember being just captivated at like, oh man, and you started this company, like you did this yourself. So there was just a fascination to the life, like about the life that he had been able to build for himself. And here he is, like it's this guy that did it. He's not, an employee of the guy that did it. He's the actual guy that did it.
Yeah.
And I think just never having been exposed to somebody that had started something that became a successful enterprise that, employed other people and was making an impact in the world and providing jobs. And so that was really fascinating to me. And then staying in contact with him afterwards was more just I think he had invited me and another friend of mine to work some events for him. So we ended up going out to Vegas and like being a contractor at one of the events, or like a NASCAR banquet that he was doing a couple months later. And so we had a couple other interactions in person between the time that I met him initially and the time that he asked me to join his business. But I was blown away by his story, what he'd accomplished. He just seemed to have an enormous amount of humility. We shared the same faith, and he just seemed like somebody that really wanted to invest in the younger generation. And it was super motivational and inspirational for me.
I got to ask you this. You talked about something just a couple of minutes ago, and I've got to go here real quick with you. What was the reunion like between you and your dad when you finally came back together? You mentioned your dad passed away, not so long ago, but you mentioned that he came back in. You left when you were a baby, came back into your life as a young man.
Yeah.
What was that like with your dad coming back into your life? And what did you learn about your dad and the reasons that he left, if he shared those with you? And, what did you really learn about your dad to go, okay, now I can put all these pieces together?
Yeah, so he came back. He just lived a very hard life, and came actually. I only found this out recently from going to his celebration of life and meeting some of his family. He actually came from a really great family. Unfortunately, his dad left when he was very, very young. I think like 6 or something like that. And I think he was the youngest of 5 or 6 kids. And so he just, I think, just had a tough upbringing with a mom that's trying to balance 6 kids. He's the youngest. He had 2 siblings that pretty tragically, passed away when he was a teenager. One of them committed suicide on my dad's birthday, which kind of haunted him the rest of his life. Another one that died, I'm pretty sure, of a drug overdose. They called it they said it had to do something with, like, it was heart failure, but really it was I think it was a drug overdose. And so it was it was a tough, he had a couple really traumatic things happen to him early in his life. And I don't know that he had the emotional support or anyone to come around him to help him process through that pain. And so, that's what I found out about him. He had gotten to a point in his life where he'd kind of hit rock bottom, and he had lost his job, and his previous marriage had had not had ended. And so he had reached out to my mom, and I think out of just, hey, I don't have anywhere to go, my mom was like, okay, well, James is in college now, you can come up to Oklahoma and stay in his room. And I remember when she told me that, my knee-jerk reaction was, this guy who bailed on you to raise two kids yourself is now wanting to come back into your life. And why would you do that? That was my knee-jerk reaction. And almost instantly I remember God like coming down into my brain and saying, like, who are you to, like, this, like, you are full of sin, and apart from like my grace in your life,
Yeah, he'll do that, man. He'll do that. Yeah.
Yeah, like, you would be in the exact same situation. So who are you to tell your mom that that she shouldn't welcome this man back in the way that I've embraced you as my son? And so so at that point, it just kind of made the mental shift for me that man, if my mom's gonna let this guy back in, then I'm going to let this guy back in. And in the same way that God has extended grace to me and forgiveness for me, why on earth would I, as the receiver of grace and forgiveness, what makes me so special to not be able to extend grace and forgiveness to this man that left when I was a little boy? And so decided that I would embrace him as well. And so when he came up to Oklahoma, I was super involved in college, so I didn't see him a lot, but would try to go to Thunder games with him whenever I could, or hang out with him on occasion, and just started to build a friendship. And it was really cool, man. It was just a really cool redemptive story, to be able to build a friendship with a guy that I just never thought would be a part of my life. And he ended up moving to Florida the last few years of his life. And so we were even, he got to be a part of my marriage, and my wife and I don't have kids yet. So he unfortunately wasn't able to be a part of, of that part of my wife and I's story. But it was really cool for him to be in such close proximity to us in the last few years of his life. So yeah, that's how that went.
No, I'm glad we took time to go there, because I wanted to file that away. I was really hoping that we could get there, and that's why I wanted to come back to it. James, I've got to ask you, what's the biggest obstacle that you've overcome, and the lesson that you learned from it?
Yeah, I think the biggest obstacle for me was probably, man, there's been a lot of them. I think going from 0 to 1, and going from doing a corporate thing and just kind of believing that I had to work for someone else, and then making that shift from I've got to work for someone else to, no, I can build something on my own. And you always think that it's going to happen so much faster than what it actually does. I mean, when we started Sweet Fish in January 2015, and I had gotten married later that year. And I remember telling my wife, we're going to make it. We're going to be millionaires. We're going to be able to be outlandishly generous with our money. Like I remember just how, like, I was so convinced of it. And I was convinced that it was going to happen like that year or the next year. And it just doesn't work out that way. We're now, 6 years into this thing, and we've got 20 employees, and the business has grown, but it just took so much more time than I thought. And so I think my encouragement for folks would be, I mean, because that was it's just a really tough reality to live in.
Go there. You're going to follow up. That's the last question I was going to ask you is, what's your biggest piece of intentional encouragement? Because I'm hearing you talk, James, and I hear a quote that I love from Dave Ramsey. He said, "It took me 20 years to become an overnight success."
Yes.
And so, share your biggest piece of intentional encouragement with somebody listening today.
Yeah. So I think my encouragement would be, it takes time. You showing up day after day after day, getting kicked in the mouth repeatedly. There's been so many parts of this journey where someone misunderstands your intent. I've been labeled things that I never thought I would have been labeled, because that's not my heart. It's not my intent, but like, people perceive things differently. There's just been so many different potholes along the way that I didn't expect. And I think the biggest thing is, it just takes time. If you want something that I hear, one of my virtual mentors is Gary Vee, and something I hear him say all the time is, if you want to live a 1% life, if you want to live a life that everybody dreams of living, right? Like, only doing the things you want to do on your timetable with the people that you want to be around. If you want to live that kind of life, then you've got to be pretty audacious to think that you can do that in a year or 2 or 3. I mean, it takes years and years and years of investing in with that focus of trying to build a certain type of life for yourself. And if you think that you're going to snap your fingers and that's just going to be handed to you on a silver platter, then you've got another thing coming, because nobody that's ever achieved the things that you want to achieve did it overnight. And I know that's, it's tried and true, because everybody says it. But I hope that somebody listening that, heard a component of my story, or some way that I framed it, that hopefully is helpful, and is hopefully something that maybe colors in a part of that advice that maybe you haven't heard before.
Well, this has been awesome. This has been wildly entertaining. I've enjoyed every minute of it. James, tell people how they can get connected with you, your content, if you're a business out there and you want to work with James and his team. Tell people how they can go about doing that.
Yeah. So James at sweetfishmedia.com is my email. Sweetfishmedia.com is our website. And then just James Carbary, Carbary on LinkedIn. Would love to connect with anybody there as well.
Yeah, you are a lover of Cherry Coke Zero, which immediately gets to my, because again, I got to share this with you, man. I didn't drink soft drinks for about 3.5 years after I had weight loss surgery. Then one day I was rolling through the Charlotte airport in Charlotte, North Carolina, saw this product called Coke Zero, and I'm like, all right, let me try this out. It was like alcohol to an alcoholic. I was at that point, I was all in. And so my 20-year-old son comes to me last year and goes, listen, you're starting to worry me. You're drinking a lot more of this than you really need to. He said, I tell you what, every time you do have a Coke Zero, you owe me $10. So that really dialed me back. I can have one on special occasions. But
thanks
man,
as
I love
always
me
to
some
producer
Coke
Brian
Zero,
Sexton,
man.
and
I
technical
probably drink
advisor
way
Matt
too much
Means,
as
and
well,
the
so I
ultimate
need to have
thanks
similar
goes to
agreement.
the
What
Lord
is the
Jesus
nectar of the
Christ, who
gods?
provides
Are
intentional
those
encouragement every day.
restaurants you go to, or the fast
And
food
until
places
next time,
that
remember,
have
everywhere,
the freestyle?
everywhere, at any time,
then
and
the
any place,
possibilities
can be
are
an intention.
Yeah, you can do raspberry, cherry, orange, peach, whatever kind of Coke Zero you think you can concoct, you can do that. So I think that's my goal someday when my son moves out and I go, well, you don't live here anymore. I'll just do what I want to do. My 1% life is having a Coca-Cola freestyle machine in my house.
Yes, I might have to tell my wife to get me that for Christmas this year.
Yeah, and Swedish fish. My son loves Swedish fish. So yeah, man, that's awesome. James Carbary, this has been a blast. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Intentional Encourager podcast.
Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it.